Good afternoon. This program is being taped on Friday, November 22nd, the 28th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Whether at work, at school, on the highway, or at home watching television, those of us over the age of 35 remember what we were doing on that fateful day in November of 1963. This man was there in Dallas on that day. He is Malcolm Kilduff, who was an assistant press secretary to the president. He accompanied President Kennedy and his wife on that trip to Texas. Mr. Kilduff was the one who announced to the world that President Kennedy had indeed been shot to death. Mr. Kilduff, we appreciate your inviting us into your home today to do this interview and for taking the time out to talk with us.
Pleasure to have you here, Bob.
I'll be back with the first question right after these words. Back to the program. I'm in Beattyville, Kentucky today at the home of Malcolm Kilduff, who was the assistant press secretary to President Kennedy. Malcolm Kilduff was there in Dallas on the day President Kennedy was shot. Malcolm, what were you doing when you heard the word that the president had been shot at?
Well, I was in the third car in the motorcade. I was assistant press secretary at the time, and I was acting press secretary for the trip. Pierre Salinger was on a trip to the Far East with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and C. Douglas Dillon, the Secretary of the Treasury. So I was in the what was known as the press pool car, which was the third car in the motorcade. Usually when you have a presidential motorcade, you have the president's car, then the Secret Service follow-up car, and then the press pool car. This is to provide the press with an up-close view of what's going on in a presidential motorcade, and it's usually just 4 reporters, the 2 wire services, a network, television network representative, and what's known as a special. At this time, it was Merriman Smith of United Press was in that car, Jack Bell of Associated Press was in the car, Bob Baskin of the Dallas Morning News, and Bob Clark for American Broadcasting Company.
Did you hear the shots?
I was sitting in the right front seat of the pool car just as we turned by the Texas School Book Depository. So I was directly under the window of the School Book Depository when we heard the first noise. When we heard the first noise, someone in the car, and I think it was Merriman Smith, said, "What was that?" I can remember my thought process of thinking, well, here we are just on top of Thanksgiving, and they sell fireworks. And I said, it sounded to me like a firecracker. And I go into a little detail there, Bob, because there was that much time for me to think and talk between the first and the second shots. Despite what you hear now that they came in rapid succession, they did not. The first shot was fired, and I thought it was a firecracker. And then the second shot. By that time, I'd noticed that up ahead of me, one of the Secret Service agents, who later turned out to be Clint Hill, had jumped off the running board of the Secret Service follow-up car and had run towards and was climbing aboard the president's car and jumping onto the car, which the Zabruta film shows. It shows Mrs. Kennedy reaching out to pull Clint Hill, who it turned out to be was her Secret Service agent, into the president's car. And then the third shot. By that time, the motorcade had sped up. We were in the process of speeding up. We went by the School Book Depository under the overpass. But at that time, by that time I had turned around and I was looking to my rear, right, and up. Now, I mention that for a very specific reason, and that is I was looking at the window, without realizing it, of the School Book Depository. There have been many theories and many people who have conjectured where the shots came from the grassy knoll. Right, if it come from the grassy knoll, I would have been looking ahead to the right or to the left for the other grassy knoll on the left-hand side. But I didn't. I turned around and I looked up. That was an immediate reaction on my part. And I have to say that if the shots weren't coming from there, why did I look up?
How long did it take you to determine or find out that the president had been wounded or killed?
When we arrived at Love Field in Dallas, the motorcade was headed for the location of his speech that day, which was to be the Trade Mart in Dallas. So we made this extra swing through downtown Dallas to catch the noonday lunch crowd for, just to have a motorcade through the town. After the shots were fired, the last thing that I thought of was that the president had been shot. The fact that the motorcade had sped up didn't surprise me. We were getting out of a trouble, whatever the trouble was, we were getting out of that area in a hurry. It never even occurred to me that perhaps the president was shot, or that anybody had been shot, until we drove by the Trade Mart. We passed it. And I said to the driver, I said, well, there's the Trade Mart, where could we be going? He said, well, it looks to me like we're going up to Parkland Hospital. Well, of course, as you know, that's exactly where we were headed. We pulled into the emergency entrance at Parkland Hospital. My car pulled in right directly behind the Secret Service follow-up car, which was directly behind the president's car. I jumped out and ran over to the president's car and, of course, found him in Mrs. Kennedy's lap in very dire straits.
Did you know he was dead at the time?
No. To me, that was still inconceivable. After all, this is the President of the United States. The President of the United States isn't going to be killed. He'd been wounded. But we had to wait for a minute because they had to get John Connally out of the jump seat, who, of course, had also been wounded. And Nellie Connally, they had to get them out of the car in order to get the president out of the car. So they got Connally out, and Nellie Connally and John went into the hospital. Then they removed the president, and they pushed the stretcher on into the emergency room with Mrs. Kennedy helping to push it, and of course she was just covered with blood on her skirt. Still, in my own mind, I didn't, well, it's a wound. It's a bad wound. It still didn't occur to me that I could have just witnessed the killing of the president.
You, of course, were the one who officially announced to the world that John F. Kennedy was dead. Can you tell us about the way the information flowed?
Well,
what happened? Who told you
Okay.
that he was dead?
After we got into the hospital, keeping in mind what I previously said, that it just never occurred to me that we could have just witnessed the killing of the president, my mind went back to the time when Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack out in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
And they set up a press room. So being the good bureaucrat that I was, I said to Wayne Hawks, one of our staffs, and Jiggs Fulver, another one of the staff, I said, go find a room that we can use as a press room, because I said, we're going to be here for a while. We'd better set up a press room. Those are the normal things you do. You get to a location, you set up a press room. So they did. They went and they found a nurse's instructional room to be used as a press headquarters. And I told the press that any announcements concerning the president's condition I would make from the classroom, it's a nurse's instruction room, on the second floor. And that I would make no announcements outside, because, doing it piecemeal, it would be sloppy. The first thing I thought of, we have to keep this thing in priorities and keep it orderly. So Wayne Hawks and Jiggs went and found this room, and they set that up. I went back into the emergency section where the rest of the president's staff was located. Kenneth O'Donnell, Dave Powers, those people who were with Mrs. Kennedy, Pamela Tenor, who was her press secretary. And it was shortly after, just a few minutes after 1 o'clock, that Dr. Malcolm Perry told me that the president was dead. Well, I went up to Kenneth O'Donnell and I said, Kenny, I said, we're going to have to make an announcement that the president is dead. And he said, don't ask me. He said, ask Johnson. And of course he was right. After we got to the hospital, the Secret Service had spirited Johnson and put him into a treatment room right next to the trauma room to put him under heavy guard. His chief Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, made sure of that. He was the one that jumped in Johnson's car and pushed him down and put his body on top of Johnson's in the race to the hospital, because he was in that motorcade too, you'll remember. So when I went into the trauma room and I walked up to Lyndon Johnson, and of course I figured he knew the president was dead. Well, I didn't know what to call him. I wasn't about to call him Lyndon. You just didn't do that with Lyndon Johnson. I came up to him and I said, "Mr. President." And Lady Bird just kind of screamed in an audible. That was the first word, according to him, not according to me. The first word that he had that John Kennedy was dead was by my calling him Mr. President.
What did Johnson say to you?
And I said, "I'm going to have to make the announcement of President Kennedy's death." And he looked just ashen white. And it was interesting to note, in retrospect, what his reaction was, Bob. You'll recall that Adlai Stevenson had been to Texas a few weeks before that, and we had the far political right was very active, with General Walker. And Adlai Stevenson had been belted with rotten eggs in Dallas. So we all thought that this was some sort of a, far right-wing activity. Lyndon Johnson was very cool. He said, "Well, now, Mac," he said, "before you make that announcement, we don't know what kind of a communist conspiracy this might be." He was thinking a communist conspiracy.
I mean, basically he's saying it was a conspiracy, he just wanted to know who was involved.
That's right, but he said this could be a communist conspiracy, and I think the best thing for me to do is get back to Air Force One before you make that announcement. I said, "All right." He said, "And then we'll wait back there, and for whatever you're going to do, and then to go back to Washington." So, with that, we left the trauma room with Johnson, went out the emergency exit of the hospital, put him in his car, and he took off for Love Field, to go back to Love Field and back to Air Force One. In that confusion, there were many people who didn't even see Johnson. They were screaming at me, for, "What's going on? What's going on?" And it was at that time that I waited until we had radio confirmation that the president was back on, and as the signal came back on my radio that Volunteer had returned to Angel. Volunteer was the code name for Johnson. Mrs. Johnson said Volunteer and Victoria. Victoria was the code name for Mrs. Johnson, had returned to Angel, Angel being the code name for Air Force One. So they had returned, and then at 1:31, someone marked the time, I didn't, but the transcript of the press conference shows that at 1:31, after conferring with Dr. Malcolm Perry on the cause of death, and talking to the Secret Service to make sure that it was all right to go ahead and make the announcement, I went to that nurse's room and made the announcement that John Kennedy was dead. He was shot in the brain here in Dallas. And I said here in Dallas, and then they asked me about Governor Connolly, who of course had been shot. Had he been hurt? Had Johnson been shot? No, he hadn't. And had Mrs. Kennedy been shot? No, she hadn't. And they wanted to know what plans were being made to go back, and I told them I'd have to get back to them later on that. But it was at 1:31 that I made the announcement that President John F. Kennedy was dead.
In the past 28 years, there of course has been a lot of investigation, a lot written, a lot said. It's debated widely as to whether or not Oswald was the lone assassin or whether there was a conspiracy, be it communist or mafia or otherwise. What do you think? Who killed John Kennedy?
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Acting alone?
Acting alone, and that's why I think it was a success. In all these 28 years, despite the Warren Commission, the Select House Committee on Assassinations, which investigated the Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, and Bobby's assassination, that Select Committee, they never came up with anything more than Lee Harvey Oswald. There's always been a lot of doubt expressed, but I think the doubt arises more in the minds of the people, Bob, because I feel that Americans as a whole don't like to think that their president is that vulnerable. But we live in a free society. The president's, Harry Truman used to go for his walk every morning around Lafayette Park. One morning, I knew President Truman. One morning he asked me to come in, went into a little place called Nichols Restaurant. We had a cup of coffee together. But that's how free a president can be if he wants to be. And it just is the nature of things that we're that free a society. And it was bound to happen, I guess, at some point or another.
Earlier you said the last thing you thought of was when you heard the noise was someone shooting at the president,
right,
trying to do him harm. Yet there was had been an indication there was an assassination plot uncovered in Miami a couple of weeks earlier. Certainly, given the politics of Dallas at the time, Kennedy was not liked in many quarters.
No, he wasn't.
Was pushing for a Civil Rights Act. He was considered to be too liberal on foreign policy in Texas. And there are those who said they had warned the president not to go there because of the political environment.
That was true, but then you turn around and you take a look at it, and you find that Lee Harvey Oswald was really not associated with any of those movements on civil rights, and he wasn't associated with.
Then why did Oswald kill Kennedy?
In my opinion, he never meant to kill Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald had been in the Marine Corps, had been discharged under less than honorable circumstances because of his, he went AWOL to Russia where he met Marina. He married Marina, then came back, and he was dishonorably discharged from the Marine Corps, and who signed off on his general court-martial papers but the Secretary of the Navy? And who was the Secretary of the Navy? John Connally. And I've always felt, and I feel to this day, that he was interested in killing John Connally. I don't think that there was never any reason, there was never a motive for Lee Harvey Oswald to have killed John F. Kennedy. But he had a motive for wanting to kill John Connally. And I think you have to look to motive. And unless you go into all these convoluted conspiracy themes, of course they want to hook it up with then Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner. He, quote, was supposed to have silenced Oswald. I don't think that was it at all. Jack Ruby had this little bar in Dallas. He was a Kennedy file, you might say. He had pictures of the Kennedys all over his bar. There were an awful lot of fans of Kennedy in those days. And here Jack Ruby he'd always been a police buff, been around a police station, but he had pictures of Jackie, and he had pictures of the president, and pictures of the children in his bar in Dallas.
Well, allow me to play devil's advocate just
sure.
a moment here on your theory about Oswald wanting to kill Connally. If he wanted to kill Connally, why did he wait until the President of the United States came to town, where there would be extra police and Secret Service protection, whereas Governor of Texas, he did not have that type of security the other days of the year?
Well, of course, and he didn't come up to Dallas either. It was a perfect opportunity. He knew exactly where he was going to be at a precise time, and it was going to be in the building where he worked. So he was going to come right by the building where he worked. What a perfect time to get him. He's driving by the building where Oswald worked.
Why do you think that there are those who are so adamant about, from their point of view, that there was a conspiracy?
Because I don't.
Why do so many people want to now in 1991 want to believe there was
Because
a conspiracy?
I don't think that they want to believe that our presidents are that vulnerable. But even though we've had attempted assassinations on President Truman, Ford, Roosevelt before, when Mayor Cermak of Chicago was killed in Miami, I just don't think that they want to feel that the President of the United States is that vulnerable to assassination. And that therefore there must have been this massive conspiracy. I think the reason it worked, if there had been a massive conspiracy, I think the Secret Service would have heard about it beforehand. We'd heard of conspiracies before, and they'd been put down, people arrested, put in jail overnight. And when Johnson was president, we were campaigning in Buffalo. I know 2 men were taken and hustled off to jail and put in jail overnight because they'd made some remark in a bar, "I'm going to kill that so-and-so." But that never, it didn't happen with Kennedy. This was one man who kept his, Oswald said nothing to anybody about his desire to kill Connally, and he just went and did it. And he was tracking his target, and the motorcade sped up. Now, if the motorcade had not sped up at that precise moment, he would have hit Connally on the first shot. But as it wasn't until the second shot that he got Connally. And then Connally, by that time, Connally had turned around, and the bullet came out his right breast, whereas if he'd shot him on the first one, it would have come out here on his left breast and right through his heart.
Okay.
It would have killed him.
You made the transition from the Kennedy administration to the Johnson administration. From what you've told me during this program, one of the first proponents of a conspiracy theory was, indeed, Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
Did he subscribe, or continue to subscribe to a conspiracy plot?
No, he did not. I never heard him. We discussed it later, and I think that he was thoroughly satisfied later in the Warren Commission finding that Oswald had acted, and had acted alone, in the conversations that I'd had with Lyndon Johnson on it. I'd never heard him dispute the Warren Commission findings on that.
At the time, right off the bat, there was a lot of talk that there was a conspiracy because of Kennedy's, quote, liberal politics.
Right.
It turned out that Johnson, a Southerner, turned out to be more liberal in implementing policy than Kennedy really had ever hoped to be. Did Johnson fear for his life?
No. Johnson felt that he could get Kennedy's, especially the civil rights package, could get it through the Congress, and he also felt that Kennedy never could have gotten that civil rights package through Congress. Now here we have a Southern Texas vice president pushing a liberal Northerners civil rights program through Congress.
Which made him more unpopular in parts of Texas than Kennedy ever.
But he said, after that bill had passed, and after we had the signing ceremony in the East Room that night, he said, well, now that finishes John Kennedy's package of legislation. Now we're going to start to worry about Lyndon Johnson's. But he had set in his own mind, and I often wonder whether he wasn't a little resentful at having to push through the Kennedy proposals, but he never showed it, because he pushed to the utmost. And I remember one night we were at a dinner, and he got Harry Byrd in the car with him, senator from Virginia, and boy, he bore down on him to get some of those Kennedy proposals through the United States Senate. But after that, it was the Great Society. But Johnson fulfilled his commitment to push through the Kennedy legislative package, and he did it as no one else could have. No one else could have gotten that package through the Congress and through the Senate that Lyndon Johnson got through in Kennedy's name.
Nowadays, of course, as a result of the Kennedy assassination, security is much tighter, or has been much tighter around all subsequent presidents. In your opinion, did the Secret Service drop the ball?
No. No, I don't. I've talked to many Secret Service agents about it, Bob, and I don't think that there's ever been a way. And I think that if they came down to push came to shove right now, that even to this day, that they would admit that a single man keeping his own counsel, who makes up his mind he's going to be at the right place at the right time, can kill any president of the United States that he wants to.
We have about a minute left. Looking back 28 years, what is the most vivid memory you have of November 22nd, 1963?
I suppose it was Lyndon Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One by a federal court judge whose appointment he had opposed, Judge Sarah Hughes. He had opposed that appointment and argued with Kennedy about it, but yet here he was, the torch was being passed, as they have said later, and Lyndon Johnson became the President of the United States aboard Air Force One, and the system of our government, despite the horrendous events of that day, continued on. To me, is the most dramatic test of the system of this country that we've ever had.
Thank you. My guest today, Malcolm Kilduff, who is the Assistant Press Secretary to President Kennedy. Malcolm was there the day President Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Appreciate you and your wife inviting us into your home today to conduct this interview.
We've enjoyed it, Bob.
That's it for today. I'm Bob Hensley. Have a pleasant afternoon.
The Hensley Report is a pre-recorded presentation of News Channel 36, which is solely responsible for its content.